So welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about the budget adjustments for unspent funds. And if you're in offering two for all of the new funds that came into your budget here recently. And I'm gonna put one more person in. So I'm gonna go through it. It's gonna be a lot of what you already saw in your email. You can stop me if you have any questions. We'll definitely take time for questions at the end as well. But as we go through it, if you have any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Okay. So carryover and what we're going to call other funding for our offering to folks. So funds have been added to your 2025 budget. You'll see it in there. All the funding is under one line item under other direct operating expenses. So if you just had carryover, you'll see carryover funds under other DOE. If you have additional funds and the second allotment, if you're in the offering to folks, then you'll see that big long line item name, but it's still going to be under other DOE. So what to do next? So next steps would be to submit budget adjustments to move these funds into other line items. And all the budget adjustments need to be completed by April 7th. The line item is in there. It's ready for your budget adjustments, so make sure that you go in and complete it by April the 7th. So just a reminder, when you go in to do a budget adjustment request, it gives you two buttons, so to speak. You can move funds between budget line items or you can add a new budget line item. So just a reminder that if you need to add a new budget line item, you need to do that first before moving funds between budget line items. So here's where it's going to be just a little bit different in that we really need a very comprehensive justification for why you're moving the funds into a new existing line item. And if you think about the type of detail that you gave us on your original budget, that's the type of detail that we need to see. And when you're in Salesforce, when you're in that form to move money, it's going to say, please provide the reason or purpose for your request. And that's what we mean by the justification. So we really want detail about what is changing, why it's changing, and how this change will support your focus area and programming. So we're going to go through each of the budget line items. I'm going to talk about what's required, and then I'm going to have an example of each one of these. So first on personnel, to detail the change. So what is happening? Are you increasing a salary? Are you increasing time percent on the grant? Are you increasing the months on the grant? For those folks that were in or are in offering two that had that first 6-month budget, then if you're adding more months to that a staff person, then that's what will go in your detail. And then why, especially if you increase the percent on the grant to cover additional activities, you want to talk about what the percent was. So let's say you're moving something from 20% to 30%. And then if you have additional activities on why you're increasing that time on the grant, then you need to send us an updated job description, and you can send it to the ARP-SA at TASA.org. And then here's an example. I'm going to go through it pretty slow because it's pretty detailed. So first of all, you want to say how much you're requesting. So you're requesting to move $7,500 into this one line item, which is for the advocate, for the sexual assault advocate, because you're going to increase the time spent on the grant from 25% to 50% for the remainder of the grant. And you've identified that for the remainder of the grant means 5 months to you. It could be 6 months, just whatever that means to you. They have a monthly salary of $6,000, which makes their annual salary $72,000, and your current approved budget is $18,000. So that is currently your current approved budget is 25% of their annual salary. Then you're adding 7,500 to this line item, which would be an additional 25% of their monthly salary for 5 months. So their salary is still $6,000 times 25%. That's $1,500 times 5 months. That's $7,500. So you really want to put right up front what you're going to request, and then all of your calculations so that you end up showing us how you came up to the amount that you're requesting. And then the why is you're increasing time spent on the grant so that that sexual assault advocate can provide services to more survivors. Maybe you just had, an influx of survivors and you need that person more, a higher percent on the grant. And then just how it will affect your grant, or how it's going to support your grant, that you'll be able to meet clients in community, which is the very definition of mobile advocacy, and therefore increasing accessibility of services to survivors. Make sense? So I want to talk just a little bit about personnel, certain positions. So you may have positions on this grant that really span across all programming. And so, such as like accounting, a grant compliance person. So really, I should be on the grant as per your cost allocation. So for instance, if your cost allocation shows that this grant can hold 25% of expenses that span across different programming, then your personnel positions that are really, they're agency-wide, they work for the whole agency, like accounting or grant compliance, should be on this grant 25%. If you're wanting to increase that, then you need to show activities on the grant that supports your percentage. So for instance, if your regular cost allocation is 20%, we wouldn't expect to see an accountant person on this grant 50% without a really good detailed explanation about what their activities are particular to this grant. So a little bit about staff incentives. So we also need to include a breakdown of the type and the amount of incentives. And so a really good example would be if you're requesting to move $5,000 to retention incentives because you're increasing your retention incentives for 10 staff. So your current incentives are $2,000 each. You want to increase that to $2,500 each, which is a $500 increase times 10 staff. That's where you get your $5,000. And then why you're wanting to increase that is that the increase of retention incentives will help you retain trained staff to better serve survivors. A little bit about incentives, because as you know, when the funding went out, we also changed the amount that grantees could spend on incentives. We increased that cap both for an overall cap and for per employee cap was raised. So, and we sent out like the guidance for all the incentives. And as you know, incentives should be paid as a one-time payment to employees. It should be like a one-time expense for all your staff. But if you've already paid incentives and now you're wanting to, because the incentives were increased, you're wanting to move some money in there so you can increase incentives, then you can make that second payment. Does that make sense? If you already made that first. If you're a very small agency and cash flow just won't allow you to pay your whole agency's incentives at one time, you can send me an email or put it in this justification and ask to do it on like a staggered basis. Say you pay 3 persons incentive, 3 staff incentive in 1 month and 3 staff incentive in the next month, if that's going to help you. But it still always should be a one-time payment per employee. Unless you've already paid those incentives and you're increasing the amount that you want to give. So let's talk about Fringe. So when you ask to move money into Fringe, include what it's going to provide. Now, it may be that you have increased percentage of a staff person on the grant. So you're increasing your percent of Fringe to make, to align with that. That is a great explanation. And then tell us why the Fringe is increasing. And so really an example might be that you're requesting 2,500 to add health insurance for this staff person. Maybe you weren't able to do health insurance and you want to do that from now until the end of the grant. And so the insurance would be $500 per month for 5 months. Again, that 5 months is because you've determined you want to pay it from here till the end of the grant. So one staff at $500 per month for 5 months is 2,500. So you're telling us what you want, and then you're telling us how you got those calculations. And then be sure to let us know that the staff is 100% on the grant. And then why? So you want to include health insurance, so to help retain staff. So professional and consultant. So include your contractor's name and description of the work to be done, and that should be percent applied to the grant, and the cost allocation method that you use. And anytime you tell us a cost allocation method, you need to include the calculations of that cost allocation method so that we can see how you got to the percent that you're applying to the grant. And so an example might be that you request to move $10,000 to this line item for counseling for survivors. The ABC Counseling Group is going to provide 100 additional counseling appointments at $100 each for a total of $10,000. So increasing the availability of counseling will help alleviate your wait list. So you've told us what, you've told us why, and the amounts. So travel. So when you're moving money into travel, include who is traveling, where, include the number of trips, the number of people, the cost of the hotel per diem, mileage, etc. Provide your calculations on how you determine the cost and the percent applied to the grant, and then tell us your cost allocation method. So an example might be that you're requesting to move a little over $800 to this line item for local mileage for the advocate who's on the grant 100%. So you estimate that to be 50 trips times 25 miles times 67 cents per mile is the amount that you're asking for. And then your why might be increasing the number of trips for staff helps us to meet with folks in community and provide mobile advocacy. So supplies. Supplies is something that is typically, you have general supplies, let's say, over the agency, and then you use your cost allocation method to see how much can it be applied to this grant. So you need to include your percent applied to the grant, the cost allocation method that you used, and your calculations that equal the amount that you're requesting. So an example might be that you request to add $2,500 to your general office supplies because your total agency supplies have increased to $2,500. So you're using a cost allocation method that is based on funding. And so you find that because of that cost allocation method that we'll talk through in just a minute, that 25% can be attributed to this grant, which is $6,250. So the current amount that you have approved is $3,750. So you're requesting an additional 2,500. Does that make sense? And then you want to show us your cost allocation method. So let's say your ARP-SA grant is 175,000. You divide that by your total agency budget, which is 700,000, and that is 25%. So that's how you can identify how much of your general office supplies you can pay for with this grant. And then why you're wanting to increase, maybe, inflation increased and the things that you are now having to purchase are more expensive, and how they support your focus area. So other direct operating expenses, also something that's typically cost allocated. So include your total expenses and the percent applied to the grant, and then your cost allocation method with your calculations. So an example would be, let's say you've never had rent on this budget before, but you want to ask for rent. So you want to move $3,750 for rent for the remainder of the grant, which is 5 months. And so you used a cost allocation method. We used the same one in this example, that your ARP-SA budget's 175,000, your agency budget is 700,000. So that's your ARP-SA grant is 25% of your total agency budget. And so your expenses that can be expensed out over, all of your programming is that 25%. So if your rent is 3,000 per month, 3,000 times 5 months, here you're asking for 5 months, is 15,000, to which 25% would be 3,750. And then why you're asking for rent, if you've never had rent on there before, might be to provide a safe and stable environment for your staff. Now, if you've had rent before, then you want to let us know how much you're increasing and then why. Maybe your rent has increased. Maybe you just, because of balancing your budget, you were only able to ask for 6 months rent, and now you want to come back and ask for the next 6 months. So really the why is very important when you start doing your justifications. So I just want to go through the cost allocations really quickly, because there's typically 4 types of cost allocations that most agencies will use. The 2 that you see on the screen are really the most popular and the ones that are most used. So the first one is funding, and this is the examples that I've been giving. So your ARPS-SA funding divided by your total operating budget, you get a percentage, and that percentage of the expenses are those that can be charged to the ARP-SA grant. You can also do what's called full-time equivalent. So divide your total full-time equivalents on your ARP-SA grant by your total full-time equivalents for the organization. You're also going to get a percent, and that's the percent that you can charge the ARP-SA grant. And most shared expenses are like rent, utilities, supplies, things like that. So another cost allocation method might be direct use. So you can use this method when you can actually use verifiable data to see how much of this expense went directly to the ARP-SA grant. This is good for meter readings, copy counts, when you have a code for ARP-SA, so you can tell exactly how many copies that you made that were for the ARP-SA grant. Then you can say it's direct use. And then another way to calculate rent is by square footage. So you calculate the total square feet and divide by the monthly rent. You get cost per square foot. And then you would need to determine the square foot that each program uses. So ARP-SA would have you would determine how much square foot ARP-SA program uses. Then you multiply the program square foot by the cost per square foot. And then you can determine how much rent can be charged to ARP-SA. one thing that's really important, no matter which one you choose, then you would use that throughout. So if you're gonna do funding, for instance, you'd use funding throughout all of the budget. So you wouldn't use funding on one and FTEs on another. You would need to pick one and use that throughout. So I just want to talk a little bit about the timeline. The budget adjustments need to be complete by April the 7th. So the week of April 11th, we're going to start reviewing the budget adjustments. I want to say that there's only two options we have when we go in to review budget adjustments. We can either approve them, or if we can't approve them how they are, we have to deny them and ask you to resubmit. There's nothing in the system that will allow us to go in and change a budget adjustment, or for you to change a budget adjustment once you've submitted it. So that's why it's really important to get your justifications, to write those out before you put them in Salesforce. If you want to talk it over, you can call me, we can get on a Zoom call. If you want to send a justification, to see if you want me to review it, I'm happy to do that, because we want to approve as many of these and keep them moving as we can. But again, if items in the justification are not there, then our only option is deny them. I'll come back to you and say, hey, in this justification, we need this, this, and this, and then you would need to resubmit. So, questions? Was that fast? Sometimes I talk fast. But feel free to put questions in the chat, or you can unmute as well.
I don't have any questions. Hi, Peggy. At the moment, I think that was very thorough. Are you also going to be providing us with a recording of your presentation today?
Yes, and I'll send out the slides as well. So what'll happen next is I'll send it to our IT folks, and they'll post it and give me a link, and then I will send it out to y'all. And question, are we able to use a de minimis rate as our cost allocation? And I'm going to have to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I will see if Roger's available and I can ask him. And you can also email him if you have any questions about the de minimis rate, because he would be our expert. But I will.
Hi, Peggy. This is Hilda. Peggy, I have a question. So the money, the carryover money, are we gonna add it to the total amount that we already have in the grant?
Yes. So when you go in Salesforce, you're going to see a line item under other DOE, and it says carryover, second allotment, and if you ask for additional funds, because you're an offering too, it'll be all three of those all added together. So you should see that in Salesforce now.
Okay. Okay, Peggy.
Hi, Peggy. This is Yvette Hill.
Hey.
Hi, I had a question. So when we do the revision, are we doing it online, or are we going to submit the forms to you?
No, you'll do it online. You'll go into Salesforce just like you would do any other budget adjustment.
Okay.
And you'll move that money through budget adjustments in Salesforce. I know it's a lot different than what we did last year. We did
Okay.
back and forth Excel, but no, this year it's in there, which is the reason why we're having this webinar and really going through what needs to be in that justification, so that when you submit it, we'll have everything we need to go in and approve them. Once we approve the budget adjustments, then you'll see it in your new line item.
Okay. So what is it going to have the line item that's gonna say carryover for that amount that we carried over?
Yours on offering two, it's gonna be all lumped in together. It's gonna be it's gonna be your carryover, your second allotment, and any additional funds that you ask for. So
Mhm.
all those are added together in one line item.
Okay, so how would we do that with the carryover? We were gonna use that for the retention checks.
Yeah, so you just move all the money in that one line item, you move it wherever you want it through budget adjustments.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, and so I know it's a little bit different this year than it was last year, because last year carryover had a specific time that you had to use it. It's not that way this time. So if you had some expenses that maybe you weren't able to bill before, but they are expenses that are allowed on the ARP-SA grant, you can reach back and bill those with this money, because this pot of money is in your budgets now. You just need to tell us where you want to move it.
okay.
Did that answer your question, Yvette?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, Peggy.
have-
It's Melissa. Oh,
Uh-huh.
it's Melissa Joseph. I'm back on the staff incentives. Is it just the one line item, or do we put it on each person that we would consider that's on the grant?
Good question. So staff incentives are one line item. You actually have a budget category called staff incentives. And so when you're moving your money, you know, when you go in and you say you want to move it from other DOE carryover and you want to move it to, and it's a drop down box. When you click that drop down box, you should see staff incentives. And
Okay.
then you can move it into one of the three types of incentives. Most generally, it's going to be retention. So your line item would be retention incentives. If you've never paid incentives before, then you would need to make that new line item. So go in, when you do your budget adjustment, you would go in and you would say you add a new line item for retention incentives. And then it's going to ask you what budget category that's under, and that's under staff incentives. You'll see it from the drop down box.
Okay.
I know the incentives is kind of, you know, it's new for some folks. So, you know, if you want to get on a call to walk through when you go to do that particular budget adjustment, we can definitely get on a call and I can walk you through it.
That would be great. And
Yeah.
it's just for the people that are on this grant. Is that
No,
correct?
No.
Oh, it can be for other staff.
Correct. So staff incentives can be paid to all staff, whether or not they were on the grant.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's a one-time payment.
There's a
Okay.
staff incentive guidelines. So one, you have to have a board approved policy on it. And there is a cap of how much you can spend on incentives. So if you don't have that, send me an email and I'll send you the full incentives guideline.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you so much, Peggy.
Mhm.
And Peggy, how do you verify that approval? Is it just providing a handbook, or do you need something authorized from your board of directors co-signing that approval?
I'm sorry, say it again. Are
For
you talking
the,
about incentives?
yeah, for that policy, that new
Okay.
requirement.
So you don't need to send us the policy, but you will need to keep it in case there is an audit. So that you would have the board policy that says like who you're going to give the incentives to, how much you're going to give each person, when you're going to distribute it. All those things should be approved by your board. And what, because HHS is our funder, right? So what they really are interested in is seeing that your board has been thoughtful about giving the incentives in a fair and reasonable manner. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So this should be reflected in the event of an audit in the board meeting minutes, in addition to, for us, it would be in our handbook.
It could be in your handbook if you have a handbook that all your policies are in, it can be in your handbook. As long as it's just a policy of how, when, who you're going to provide the incentives to, and that your board has approved it.
Okay, and if our organization previously have received funds for retention incentives, would there be a record of that in our Salesforce portal?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, so if you go into Salesforce and maybe you can look at this year's grant to see if you put any money into your budget for incentives, but you could also go into last year's grant, because when you go into your portal, it'll give you a list of all your grants, and if they're active, they'll say manage or they'll say closed. You could go into your last year's grant and see exactly how much money was paid in incentives last year.
okay, and last question, so just clarifying that the unspent funds has already been added to our pre-existing budget, but I would go in and manually create a new budget adjustment through Salesforce.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, they've already been added to your budget. So when you go into your grant, you're going to see your budget approved amount is higher than your original amount because all those funds are already there. But this time we just put it in one line item and going to let you reallocate it through budget adjustments.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Peggy, it's Melissa Joseph again with Resource and
Yeah.
Crisis Center. Back to the question that Delisha just asked, could a board resolution suffice for that approval from them, or does it, we'd have to show the policy that they signed for? That
Well,
they
I mean,
approved?
the board resolution could be written like a policy, right? If it has all those
Right.
components, yeah, it doesn't have to have any particular format.
Okay,
What they're interested in seeing is that you're doing it fairly throughout the agency, and then how, when, where, to whom you're distributing it, and that your board has approved. So how they want to do that is up to y'all.
that's okay, great. That answers my question. Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? Okay, so I have something back from Roger about the de minimis question. It says, de minimis rate is generally used for indirect costs. Cost allocation depends upon different methodologies of calculating the direct cost. And then he would need additional information, maybe an example of how they want to use it. So when we're using a cost allocation method, we're trying to determine the direct cost for this grant, whether it's rent, whether it's utilities. I know there is a de minimis rate, but I really, yeah, like Roger says, it doesn't really speak to direct cost. But if you had additional questions, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to him. Any other questions? Well, I'm gonna stop the recording.